Welcome back to the Help for Leaders podcast. I'm Stacey Harris. Before we dive into today's episode, click here to subscribe, hit that thumbs up, ring that bell so you'll be notified each week of every episode. On today's podcast, I've got a special guest joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I've got Monique Maley joining me. She is the founder and president of Articulate Persuasion. Monique and I met a few years ago. I actually thought she still lived here in Austin, and so I invited her to sit here beside me on this podcast. But here I am, feeling like a DJ today with this microphone, and we've had some technical difficulties, but really excited to dive into this conversation. So welcome, Monique. I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Tell us about your history, your background, your passion, kind of your purpose for your business. So welcome, Monique, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Yes, it has been a few years since we met. I just don't even need to go into how long ago that was, but I'm so deeply grateful that we did. Yes, so I have had my business, Articulate Persuasion, since 2011. And my work is in leadership development and communication. So I love to work with what I like to call entrepreneurial leaders. And that is sometimes founders, often founders and entrepreneurs. But also I find that there are people who are entrepreneurial who work within larger organizations. So the way I think of these leaders are people who are a bit more risk tolerant, always looking for problem solving solutions, never quite happy with the status quo, looking ways to improve. And why I love to work with them is part of what they're always looking to improve is themselves as leaders, which, as we know, if the leader doesn't grow 2 steps ahead of the business isn't going to go very far. So those are the people I really love to work with. And I've been so lucky to work across all kinds of industries, every size of business, every flavor of leader. And that's what keeps me so excited about the work that I do. And my background, the way I came to it, when I tell people, it sort of sounds rather circuitous, but the truth is that it makes complete sense. So my first professional career was in theater and film. I started as an actor. I trained classically in London at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And I can go into later how many tools are in my toolkit today because of all of that. And I worked in on stage and then behind the scenes, and finally in film finance and development work in the latter stages of that part of my journey. And what I realized is that I love the performing and I love finding the character, but I really love the business as well. So after that, I started 2 other businesses. And when I went to start this business, someone asked me something really interesting, which, when was the last time you couldn't wait to get out of bed in the morning to go to work? And for me, the rehearsal process was always the most exciting part of the work. And in a way, what I do with clients now in the coaching and consulting is a bit about let's look at this character. Let's look at how you're showing up. Let's look at how you're communicating. What is the text, the subtext, the body language, the tone, all of those things that inform how we communicate with other people. And so Articulate Persuasion was born, and I love it. And as you said, I moved from Austin after a few years there, and I moved to DC, and I'm still busy doing what I love.
I love it. It's so interesting to me, your background as an actor and how you've brought all of that knowledge and that expertise into your leadership development. That's what fascinated me when we first met, and I love all of your background. And so thank you for sharing all of that great information. Let's talk about DISC, because that's what brought us together. We were, all those years ago. And so I'd love for you, I know you just recently retook a DISC assessment, and so there's been some changes over the last couple of years. So I'd love for you to tell our audience your DISC style, and even let's talk about kind of those changes that you've seen over the past couple of years primarily, and some of the roles that are changing in your life as well.
So it's so interesting. So when I did this, it was shamefully, I should have done it sooner, but it was 7 years ago. But the last 2 years don't count. So it's really, I tell people 5 years, so I'm on time. But I definitely wanted to take it in advance of our conversation today. So my style, as I have been talking about it for the last 7 years, has been IDSC. And when I took it last week, my D went from my natural state of 48 to my natural state of 92. So I am now a DISC. And it was a real shock for me, honestly. First of all, because I couldn't imagine anything being higher than my I. And I think if you think of I being influenced, someone who is highly verbal, right? My work requires me to be talking for a living. I'm very comfortable with that. The name of my business, Persuasion, is one of the terms that is used to describe people who are high I's. So the idea that there was something else higher was really surprising, especially because it was such a jump. And I have to see, even with clients that I've done more than one disc with over time, I have never seen that drastic a change. And so I am very interested and curious, and I'm going to dig down more into it. First of all, holy cow, how's that showing up for my team? Because that is I'm going to have to slow down working with my team, engaging with them, having conversations with them to address how is a super high D showing up, because that can be as anything, when you're too high in anything, there are moments where that can be incredibly beneficial and incredibly destructive. I always tell people that there's no ideal profile, that the only thing is that whatever you are high in, it's a bit like the force, it's a light and a dark side. And you have to know when to bring each one out. And so for me, it's really going to be about digging into how is that showing up for my team and why did I miss that? And I also wonder how much of that has to do with, needing to drive and power through what has been a pretty challenging couple of years, especially for those of us in the professional services businesses, which has had its own benefits. Thank you, Zoom. And its challenges as well for growth. So yeah, it's been a very mixed bag. And the other thing that changed, but this one didn't surprise me at all, was I was never particularly high in C. So when I first took the disc and was really learning about it with you, it made sense to me that I have never been sort of the minutia, the detail. When I tell my clients about C, I think high C's are those people who can see a black grain of sand in a sea of white. And I've always said about myself that I don't even see the sand, I see a beach. So I knew C was never my thing. But now it's come down, but that makes sense because I have a bigger team than I had the last time I took it. So maybe I just don't feel the need to leverage my C as much as I felt I needed to then.
So interesting. I have seen changes happening the last couple of years, especially. But yes, our graphs can change, and you're feeling it. You're seeing it. I know you shared with me some even changes in your personal life. You've got a son that's about to graduate from high school, and all of those transitions, even in our personal lives, can impact the way we are communicating with others. But I would say you're right. In professional services, the last 2 years, that drive for results, we're needing to push forward in that area. And so I felt that as well in my own style, shifting really significantly at times. But behavior is situational, and so we are constantly changing. And I would say that awareness piece, I love that you said, I need to be aware of how this is impacting my team, how others are perceiving me, how I'm communicating in that way. So I think that is super significant and such a great point. So I'd love to transition. So thank you for sharing about your DISC background, those two different styles, but I'd really like to just kind of talk about just leadership in general. How do you define leadership?
My definition of leader is pretty simple. Someone that other people follow. And it sounds really simple, but I don't think it's a metric that enough people use when they really look at their own leadership. They think title has something to do with it, or responsibility has something to do with being a leader, or being out sort of in the world, thought leadership and all of that sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, if people are not following you, you are not a leader. I don't care what your title is. I don't care how much you get paid. I don't care anything else that's happening. And I try with my clients to keep reminding them that you're not leading a business, right? You're leading the people who are allowing the business to exist and grow. And the old saying is that, we don't manage people, we manage systems, we lead people. And so I think that people have to kind of get out of that mindset that leading is about the numbers exclusively and growing and all those sorts of semi-external things. And yet the single biggest line item on any company's P&L is always going to be its people. And
So
if
good.
leaders truly focus on having those people follow them, then the results are going to show up everywhere else. It's going to be, yes, better revenue, but also better culture, higher retention, opportunities for growth in areas that leadership might not have known about because somebody else at a different level in the organization has open lines of communication that can share them. Those sorts of things, if the leader focuses on being great at having people follow them, then a lot of the other things start to take care of themselves.
So good. I love it. Yeah, it's all about the people. We've got to remember that. And that's where communication comes in and is so important. So let's talk about, and maybe it's a leader that you've worked with, or maybe it's a leader you've even had in your past work experience, but I'd love for you to think about kind of the worst leader you've ever encountered. And let's talk about some of those things that they did that weren't so great. I'd love to hear just some things that maybe the way they communicated, the way they made you feel, and then we're going to switch gears and talk about a best leader as well.
So I'm really glad that this question was something you sent me in advance, because I had to whittle this list right down. Unfortunately, I have more people on that list than I would want. But sort of two people really came to mind, and I really couldn't edit it down to just one. So the first one is someone who was my direct boss, highly successful in some metrics, as people might determine, certainly extremely senior, and influential. But actually, his influence came exclusively from his access to certain people, and the fact that he scared the pants off of most of the people around him. I mean, he was one of those people who really thrived on fear. I will never forget the very first day I met him when I went in for the job interview. He was walking down the hall, and he had these sort of red face, and he had an empty box, and he was kicking the box down the hall, swearing about someone who is a client.
Wow.
And everyone sort of ran for the hills. You saw doors closing as the hall, as he came down the hall. And I just stood there and I started laughing hysterically, to which the people around me thought I was completely mad. But all I could think of is, what kind of a child? I didn't even know this is the person I was going to be interviewing with. And I got the job, and I really wanted to work at this company, and he didn't scare me. So I took the role, and it was really shocking to me. I mean, he really does wear people down. I mean, there was one day where even that kind of dark energy coming my way constantly is so depleting and exhausting. And I found out that the woman who had the role before me had been there for a week and a half before she went to lunch one day and never came back. And
Wow.
I realized that that's a really extreme example, but he wasn't leading anybody. The only reason people called him, the only reason he was in the position he was in, he was the gatekeeper to a lot of very important people. And he was a great negotiator. And
Interesting.
so some years later, he left that organization and went to head a company for one of the existing clients of that company. They had a falling out. And suddenly he didn't have that job. He didn't have the other job. And he was a pariah everywhere. All of a sudden, he realized he was not a leader. He realized that he had not built up any kind of a following and that nobody was behind him.
Wow.
And he sort of disappeared into nowhere land. I mean, one of the most powerful people in that business. And he totally disappeared.
Wow.
And that is an extreme example where not everybody's a yeller screamer, but there are more out there than people even acknowledge. The toxic relationships, like it's like a bad dating relationship. They really do exist. And I still see this sort of thing happening in different ways. And then the other example I have is of a client who, it was really interesting because I asked her this very question. She was at a big organization. She had a great job, but she really wanted to move up, and she wanted to move up in a different department in the same organization. And she kept applying for roles and got down to the last 2 or 3 and then was never, it never went to her. And so we were talking about, her team and, wondering, because she was saying, well, I think that they just put in a bad reference for me and and it's their fault. And I said, well, how many of them would follow you if you changed departments? And she said, well, I wouldn't want to take any of them with me. They're all idiots.
Oh,
To which I said, okay, but how many of them would want to follow you? And that shift for her was a shock. The idea that she couldn't just condescend to people, that she couldn't just be angry at them for them to grow and learn and be better, was a bit of a shocker. And
Wow.
she took a bit of a break in our engagement because I don't think she could process it. And it took her almost 6 months to come back. And she was then open to looking at what does that really mean? What have I been doing? And that for me is the interesting work with leaders is what are the obstacles that are in your way that you yourself are creating, not that are coming from a pandemic or from even somebody on your team who's not working out well. What are you doing that you could shift to make things better?
So interesting. Both of those individuals, obviously very low self-awareness and lots of opportunity to grow. Fear, control, man, some really powerful emotions. Yes. So let's flip the table, and I want to hear about one of the best leaders you've ever experienced and worked with and kind of what they did and how that made you feel.
I had one person in mind, but as I was getting ready for today, I realized that I wanted to also split it into 2 because one is such a great counterexample to that second client that I mentioned. This other client, very successful CTO at an organization, but was working in a very unhealthy relationship that her CEO was not a good leader. And she was staying for her people. She was staying because she didn't want to abandon them. And what we ended up having the conversations around in terms of that. So she was so empathetic, right? She was so high S, I think is really what she was. She was really looking after that as much as she was looking at the tech. Is that I said, but you're telling them it's okay to stay in this unhealthy relationship. And I said, how many of them would follow you if you left? Again, same question, very different answer. And so she left. And 5 of the people who worked for her on her team over the next year ended up coming to work for her where she was.
Interesting.
And so I think that is whatever our profile is. I think that if we stay focused again on the people that we're leading and providing them with the tools to be successful, and communicating that that's what we are there to do, then the aperture for what's possible for you and your organization goes up exponentially.
Absolutely.
But when we communicate that you don't matter to me, when we communicate that I will let you talk, but I will not truly hear you, when what we communicate, whatever values we paint on a wall, is that, you know, we're in it for the money and we don't care if we burn everybody out. You know, it's all of those things. That's all communication. It is not about what you say. It's as much about what you don't say and you don't do and how you say it, and how you don't say it, that communicates so much to those people who are really driving your business.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. So fascinating that you asked the same question, two very different responses, and then the team members' response. Yeah, I'm not surprised that 5 people followed her. That's
and
great.
Then let me just quickly tell you about the second
Yeah.
leader, because I think he's interesting. A lot of people have a hard time following someone who's very high D, because high Ds are all the D words, right? They're determined, they're driven, they're decisive, all great things, but too much D can be a bit of a bull in a china shop and can sometimes be so data forward that they forget to be people centered. And yet I work with a colleague who is very high D and who really has worked over the years to focus in on his understanding of the people who are around him and how to bring out the best in them. He is one of the most enjoyable people to work with. He gets so much done. But what's so exciting for me is to see how much he brings out of the people who work with him. And that has been a really intentional, how do I leverage my current profile, but how do I mitigate the places where it might create challenges for me and my team?
Thank you so much for sharing all that insight and wisdom. And then one final question as we wrap up this episode. I'd love to hear just any advice that you might give to future leaders or someone who's maybe looking at that next role in their career and thinking about leadership and just communication. What advice would you give that person?
I actually often I work with a lot of early stage founders. I'm a mentor with a number of organizations. And so I have kind of boiled this down to 2 things, which I really try to encourage folks to think about. Number one is that whatever your own style is, remember that doesn't matter as much as what the style of the person that you're talking to is. People want to be spoken to in their own language. And it is so much more powerful for you to make an effort to find out what somebody else's style is. And that's why DISC for me is such a great tool, because it can give you an automatic window. And I love the report in particular that you guys produce, because I always tell my clients that page that says, you know, how to communicate with Monique and how not to communicate with Monique is a roadmap for successful communication.
Yes.
But understanding that from your team as well. So I encourage clients in onboarding conversations, ask people, how do you like to hear bad news? How do you like to be rewarded? Because if you're rewarding someone in a way that speaks to you, but doesn't speak to them, then what you communicate to them is you don't value them. And that wasn't your intention. So remembering that we have to kind of get to know the people that we lead so we can communicate with them in their language, I think that's really important. And the flip side of that becomes about our own communication style, which we hopefully will be constantly, I mean, life just obviously, as I talked about my own profile, it's constantly evolving for a million different reasons. And we have to really digest and look at and assess what our own style is, but we have to do it without judgment. So I say self-assess without being self-critical, because I think it's like a mirror, right? The mirror is just a piece of glass, and that glass has no judgment. And yet when we look in that mirror, we tend to judge an awful lot. And I find that sometimes as people are growing in their leadership, they don't want to particularly look in that mirror of those things, because they feel there's some judgment about themselves. I say, look at it honestly, not because it's bad or it's good. There is no right profile. There is just, when does it serve me and when does it get in my way? And how can I turn that volume up and down to help me be more productive, effective as a leader, and to make my company more effective?
I love it. Oh my gosh, such great wisdom about style flexibility and the need to flex and understand other people's preferences in communication. I love that you referenced the report as being that roadmap of these are ways to communicate with me. It's so good. And I even love that reference that you were just mentioning on dialing it up and dialing it down, kind of like the volume on the radio of what do we need to dial up in that moment? What do we need to dial down? Because communication is so important. You've heard me say it over and over and over again. And I love, Monique, that you're just emphasizing so much of those things that are important for all of us, especially leaders, when we are leading others, when we have those people that are following. I love your simple definition, honestly, of leadership is someone who has followers. So when we can communicate in a way that people want to get on board and run with us in that same direction, that's really powerful. So thank you so much for joining me. Hope you've learned something this week. Join us next week on More Help for Leaders. If you enjoyed this episode and would like more information on emotional intelligence, behavioral styles, or communication, I'd love for you to click here to watch more episodes. And we'd also love for you to click here to subscribe so you're notified each week when we post more content.